I just come across something very interesting, just as a follow-on from the last video about the surprising things one learns about the original Jewish Palestinian community of Christian believers. I was just looking at this book, The Islamic Jesus, how the King of the Jews became a prophet of the Muslims. And it says some really interesting little things here I just want to share with you. Chapter 4, The Missing Link, has a quote from a well-known German professor of religions and religious history at a university in Germany, Hans-Joachim Schoeps, if I pronounce his name correctly. He is quoted as saying, "Here is a paradox of world historical proportions. Jewish Christianity indeed disappeared within the Christian church, but was preserved in Islam." Isn't that extraordinary? A paradox of amazing proportions. Jewish Christianity disappeared, as we know, within the church, but was preserved in Islam. And that's the beginning of the chapter, that quote. And then it gets even more interesting. He quotes, the author of this book quotes more writings on the continuum, he calls it, between Jewish Christianity and Islam. And how this is largely unnoticed even by most of the experts in academia. It is really astonishing that this discussion has had virtually no resonance among specialists in Arabic and Islamic studies. The eminent theologian, Father Hans Kung, who's a Catholic, also found it astonishing that the unmistakable parallels between the Qur'an and the understanding of Christ in Jewish Christian communities have found only a few echoes. One major reason, Kung argues, is the common unwillingness to ask disturbing questions. Quote, "Not only Muslim theologians, but also Christian dogmatic theologians of all confessions often simply ignore inconvenient results of exegetical and historical truth." And then the author of this book explores them. There's a little detail here which I'd completely forgotten about, and I wish I'd shared this before. There is a scholar called Patricia Crone. Now, if you know anything about Quranic studies in the West, you'll know all about Patricia Crone. She was she died in 2015. She was an American-Dutch historian specializing in early Islamic history and the Quran. And she was probably one of the most, if not the most famous Western scholar of the Quran. She said many controversial things and changed her views quite radically over the years. But the reason I'm quoting, mentioning her is because the author of this book says this: the images of the images of Jesus in Jewish Christianity and Islam are very similar, if not identical, as well. We mentioned that the Quran insists that Jesus was the Messiah, which is interesting, for it was probably an alien concept for 7th century pagan Arabs. Also interesting is the Quran's emphasis that Jesus was sent to the Jews. That he was, as the Quranic verse noted, a messenger to the children of Israel. The seemingly insignificant but actually impressive point here was captured by Patricia Crone, who suggested, quote, that Jesus was sent to the Israelites is an astonishing claim for a 7th century preacher to make. That's Patricia Crone. Why astonishing? Because unless one had a sense of historical Jesus, one would rather think that Jesus was sent to Christians. That is, in fact, what most Muslims readily think today, imagining that Moses is the prophet of the Jews and Jesus is the prophet of the Christians, and Muhammad is the prophet of Muslims. Therefore, Patricia Crone suggests from her perspective, and quoting here, one would have expected the messenger, i.e. Muhammad, to say that Jesus was sent to the Christians. Of course, there were no Christians before Jesus, but this would hardly have prevented the messenger from seeing God as sending Jesus to them. And even if we assume his historical sense to have been too well developed for him to do so, one would have expected him to say that the Israelites responded to his preaching by dividing into Jews and Christians, which is historically correct. But what he actually says is that they divided into believing and unbelieving Israelites, in Qur'an 61:14. In religious terms, they split, but ethnically, they remain the same. And then he quotes from Jewish Christian texts which use precisely that language. And the Quran's perspective, Patricia Crone goes on to say, is unquestionably Jewish Christian. So in other words, this is a remarkable, shall we say, bit of luck that the Quran gets it very technically correct here from the leading historian's point of view. He wasn't just using anachronistic language of later centuries. He was, when he was referring to the Israelites into breaking into two groups, this is precisely correct. They weren't really just Christians and Jews. They were Israelites, some who believed in the Messiah and some who didn't. And as Jimmy Dunn was being discussed earlier, he made the same point. So this is a fascinating insight, little detail where the Quran gets it very precisely right, but also, and perhaps more importantly, that the Jesus of the Jewish Christian faith, the earliest faith, is fundamentally the same as the Islamic understanding. Here is a paradox of world historical proportions. Jewish Christianity, in other words, the original Christianity of the faith, indeed disappeared. So at the end of the 1st century, in the 2nd century, as I've said before, it became seen as heretical and unorthodox, and the early church fathers polemicized against it, and it was ultimately suppressed. So that disappeared within the emerging Catholic Christian church, but was preserved in Islam. So one could say that to be a good a good follower of Jesus today, you would follow Islam and not what we call Christianity. At least that's the lesson of history, one could argue. So I do recommend this book, by the way. I read it a long time ago, and it's very good. It's a Muslim author. I think he's American, and it's had some good reviews on the back. So there we go. I just thought I'd just share that little addendum with you, just to ride on the back of the previous video.